Section 34 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 22. Part 1. Loretta's letter had informed Inglesant that she would endeavour to let him know where she was, and with that hope he was obliged to be content, as by no effort he could make could he discover any trace of the fugitive's route. Florence, however, became distasteful to him, and he would have left it sooner but for an attack of fever which prostrated him for some time. Few foreigners were long in Italy in those days without suffering from the climate and the miasmas and unhealthy vapours which, especially at night, were so hurtful even to those accustomed to the country. In his illness Inglesant was carefully nursed by some of the Jesuit fathers and those whom they recommended, and it is possible that they took care that he should not be left too much to the care of the physicians, whose attentions at that period, at any rate, were so often fatal to their patients. In the course of a few weeks he was sufficiently recovered to think of leaving Florence, and he dispatched a messenger to Don Agostino, begging him to meet him at Lucca, where they might decide either to visit Venice or go on straight to Rome. It was not without some lingering hope that he might find Loretta in the town of her birth that he set out for Lucca, but misfortune followed his path. It was reported that the plague had broken out in Florence, and travellers who were known to have come from thence were regarded with great suspicion. Inglesant's appearance, recently recovered from sickness, was not in his favour, and at Fucecchio, a small town on the road to Lucca, he was arrested by the authorities and confined by them in the pest house for 40 days. It was a building which had formerly been a gentleman's house, and possessed a small garden surrounded by a high wall. In this dreary abode Inglesant passed many solitary days, the other inmates being 3 or 4 unfortunates like himself, travellers on business through the country, who, their affairs being injured by their detention, were melancholy and despondent. He was short of money, and for some time was unable to communicate with any of his friends either in Florence or Siena. With nothing but his own misfortunes to brood upon, and with the apprehension of the future, which almost amounted to religious melancholy, frequently before his mind, it is surprising that he kept his reason. To add to his misfortunes, when the greater portion of the time fixed for his detention was expired, one of the inmates of the pest house suddenly died, and although the physicians pronounced his disease not to be the plague, yet the authorities decreed that all should remain another 40 days within its dreary walls. The death of this person greatly affected Inglesant, as he was the only one of the inmates with whom he had contracted any intimacy. During the first part of his sojourn here there was brought to the house as an inmate a wandering minstrel who, the first evening of his stay, attracted the whole of the gloomy society around him by his playing. He played upon a small and curiously shaped instrument called a viol, somewhat like a child's toy, with 4 strings and a kind of small wheel instead of a bow. It was commonly used by blind men and beggars in the streets, and was considered a contemptible instrument, though some of these itinerant performers attained to such skill upon it that they could make their hearers laugh and dance, and it was said even weep, as they stood around them in the crowded streets. Inglesant soon perceived that the man was no contemptible musician, and after his performance was over he entered into conversation with him, asking him why he, who could play so well, was content with so poor an instrument. The man, who appeared to have a great deal of intelligence and humour, said that he was addicted to a wandering and unsettled life among the poor and disorderly classes in the low quarters of cities, in mountain villages, and in remote hostelries and forest inns; that the possession of a valuable viol or other instrument, even if he should practise sufficient self-denial to enable him to save money to purchase such a one, would be a constant anxiety to him, and a source of danger among the wild companions with whom he often associated. "Besides, signore," he said, "I am attached to this poor little friend of mine, who will speak to me, though to none else. I have learnt the secrets of its heart, and by what means it may be made to discourse eloquently of human life. You may despise my instrument, but I can assure you it is far superior to the guitar, though that is so high-bred and genteel a gentleman, found in all romances and ladies' bowers. For any music that depends upon the touch of a string, and is limited in the duration of the distinct sounds, is far inferior to this little fellow's voice." "You seem trained to the profession of music," said Inglesant. "I was serving lad to an old musician in Rome, who not only played on several instruments, but gave a great deal of time to the study of the science of harmony and of the mysteries of music. He was fond of me, and taught me the viol, as I was apt to learn." "I've heard of musicians," said Inglesant, "who have written on the philosophy of sound. He was doubtless one of them." "There are things concerning musical instruments," said the man, "very wonderful, such as the laws concerning the octaves of flutes, which make them how you will, you can never alter, and which show how the principles of harmony prevail in the dead things of the world, which we think so blockish and stupid, and what is more wonderful still, the passions of men's souls, which are so wild and untamable, are all ruled and kept in a strict measure and mean, for they are all concerned in and wrought upon by music. And what can be more wonderful than that a maestro in the art can take delight in sound, though he does not hear it, and when he looks at some black marks upon paper, he hears intellectually, and by the power of the soul alone." "You speak so well of these things," said Inglesant, "that I wonder you are content to wander about the world at village fairs and country weddings, and do not rather establish yourself in some great town, where you might follow your genius and earn a competence and fame." "I've already told you," replied the man, "that I am wedded to this kind of life, and if you could accompany me for some months with your viol d'amour across the mountains and through the deep valleys, and into the old towns where no travellers ever come, and where all stand still from century to century, you would never leave it, any more than I shall. I could tell you of many strange sights I've witnessed, and if we stay long in this place, perhaps you will be glad to hear some tales to while away the time." "You spoke but now," said Inglesant, "of the power that music has over the passions of men. I should like to hear somewhat more of this." "I will tell you a curious tale of that also," said the man. THE VIOL PLAYER's STORY. Some 25 years ago there lived in Rome two friends who were both musicians and greatly attached to each other. The elder, whose name was Giacomo Andrea, was maestro di capella of one of the churches. The other was an accomplished lutenist and singer. The elder was a cavaliere and a man of rank, the younger of respectable parentage, of the name of Veneo. The style of music in which each was engaged was sufficiently different to allow of much friendly contention, and many lively debates took place as to the respective merits of sonata da Chiesa and sonata da Camera. Their respective instruments also afforded ground for friendly dispute. Veneo was very desirous that his friend should introduce viols and other instruments into the service, in concert with the voices in the church in which Veneo himself sang in the choir. But the cavaliere, who considered this a practice derived from the theatre, refused to avail himself of any instrument save the organ. Veneo was more successful in inducing his friend to practise upon his favourite instrument, the lute, though Andrea pretended at first to despise it as a lady's toy, and liable to injure the shape of the performer. His friend, however, though devoted to secular music, brought to the performance and composition of it so much taste and correct feeling, that Andrea was ravished in spite of himself and of his preference to the solemn music of the church. Veneo excelled in contrasting melancholy and pensive music with bright and lively chords, mingling weeping and laughter in some of the sweetest melodies that imagination ever suggested. He accompanied his own voice on the lute, or he composed pieces for a single voice with accompaniment for violins. In a word, he won his friend over to this grave chamber music, in some respects more pathetic and serious than the more monotonous masses and sonatas of the church composers. Veneo composed expressly for this purpose fantasies on the chamber organ, interposed now and then with stately and sweet dance music, such as pavans, so named from the walk of a peacock, almains, and other delightful airs, upon the violins and lute. In these fancies he blended, as it were, pathetic stories, gay festivities, and sublime and subtle ideas, all appealing to the secret and intellectual faculties, so that the music became not only an exponent of life, but a divine influence. After these delightful meetings had continued for several years, circumstances obliged Veneo to accompany a patron to France, and from thence he went over into England to the great king of that nation as one of his private musicians, for the Queen of England was a French princess and was fond of the lute. His departure was a great grief to the cavalier, who devoted himself more than ever to church music and to the offices of religion. He was a man of very devout temper, and was distinguished for his benevolent disposition, and especially for his compassion for the poor, whom he daily relieved in crowds at his own door, and in the prisons of Rome, which he daily visited. From time to time he heard from his friend, to whom he continued strongly attached. I was brought up at the English courts at Inglesant, and have been trying to recall such a man, but cannot recollect the name you mention, though I remember several Lieutenants and Italians. I tell the story as I heard it, replied the other. The man may have changed his name in a foreign country. One day the cavalier had received a letter from his friend, brought to him by some English gentleman travelling to Rome. Having read it, and spent some time with the recollections that its perusal suggested to his mind, he set himself to the work in which he was engaged, the composition of a motet for some approaching festival of the church. But although he attempted to fix his mind upon his occupation, and was very anxious to finish his work, he found himself unable to do so. The remembrance of his friend took complete possession of his mind, and his imagination, instead of dwelling on the solemn music of the motet, wandered perversely into the alluring world of fantaside melody which Veneo had composed. Those sad and pensive adagios, passing imperceptibly into the light gaiety of a festival, never seemed so delightful as at that moment. He rose from time to time and walked to and fro in his chamber, and as he did so he involuntarily took up a lute which Veneo had left with him as a parting gift, and which always lay within reach. As he carelessly touched the strings, something of his friend's spirit seemed to have inspired him, and the lute breathed again with something of the old familiar charm. Each time that he took it up, the notes formed themselves again under his hand into the same melody, and at last he took up a sheet of paper intended for the motet, and scored down the air he had involuntarily composed. His fancy being pleased with the occurrence, he elaborated it into a lesson, and showed it to several of his associates. He gave it the name of Gili Amici, and it became very popular among the masters in Rome as a lesson for their pupils on the lute. Among those who thus learnt it was a youth who afterwards became page to a Florentine gentleman, one Bernard Guasconi, who went into England and took service under the king of that country, who, as you doubtless know better than I do, was at war with his people. I know the Cavaliere Guasconi, said Inglesant, and saw him lately in Florence, where he is training running horses for the Grand Duke. This war, continued the man, appears to have been the ruin of Veneo, for the English people, besides hating their king, took to hating all kinds of music, and all churches and choristers. Veneo lost his place as one of the king's musicians, and not being able to earn his living by teaching music where so few cared to learn, he was forced to enlist as a soldier in one of the king's armies, and was several times near losing his life. He escaped these dangers, however, but the army in which he served being defeated and dispersed, he wandered about the country, wounded and suffering from sickness and want of food. He supported himself miserably, partly by charity, especially among the loyalist families, and partly by giving singing lessons to such as desired them. He was without friends or any means of procuring money to enable him to return to Italy. As he was walking in this manner one day in the streets of London, without any hope and with scarcely any life, he heard the sound of music. It was long since the melody of a lute, once so familiar, had fallen on his ear, and as he stopped to listen, the notes came to him through the thick, moist air like an angelic and divine murmur from another world. The music seemed to come from a small room on the ground floor of a poor inn, and Veneo opened the door and went in. He found a young man, plainly dressed, playing on a double-necked theorbo lute, which, from the number of its strings, enables, as you know, the skilful lutenist to play part music with all the varieties of fugues and other graces and ornaments of the Italian manner. The piece which the young man was playing consisted of an allegro and yet sweet movement on the tenor strings, with a sustained harmony in thorough bass. The melody, being carefully distributed through the parts, spoke to Veneo of gaiety and cheerfulness, as of his old Italian life, strangely combined at the same time with a soothing and pathetic melancholy, like a corpse carried through the streets of a gay city, strewn with flowers, and accompanied with tapers and singing of boys. The whole piece finished with a pastoral or strain of low and sweet notes. As Veneo listened, he was transported out of himself. It was not alone the beauty of the music which ravished him, but he was conscious that a mysterious presence, as of his friend the cavaliere, was with him, and that at last the perfect sympathy which he had sought so long was established, and that in the music he had heard a common existence and sphere of life was at last created, in which they both lived not any longer separate from each other, but enjoying, as it were, the one common being of melody and ecstatic life of sound. When the music ceased, Veneo accosted the lutenist and inquired the name of the composer, but this the young man could not tell him. He only knew it was a favourite lesson for skilful pupils among the music masters in Rome, and as such he had learnt it. Veneo was confident the piece had been written by Andrea, and by none other, and told the young man so. By this time they had discovered that they were fellow countrymen, and the lutenist sent for refreshments, of which Veneo stood very much in need. He also told him that his name was Scacchi, and that he was page to the Signore Bernard Guasconi, who was then in arms for the king, and was besieged in some town of which I have forgotten the English name. It was Colchester, said Inglesant. I was in prison at the time of the siege, but I know the history of it and its sad ending. Becoming very familiar with Veneo, he advised him to accompany him to Colchester. His master, he said, would doubtless be set at liberty immediately as a foreigner and a friend of the Grand Duke's, and he could accompany him home to Italy as a domestic. As no better prospect was open to Veneo of returning to his native country, he gladly accepted the page's offer and agreed to accompany him next day. The besiegers of the town, which you call Colchester, were engaging persons from all parts of the country to work their trenches, and the town not being far from London, many persons went from that place to earn the wages offered. Many of the loyalists also took advantage of this pretext, intending to join the besieged if a favourable opportunity offered. To one of these parties Veneo and the page joined themselves. You may wonder that I know so much of these matters, but I have heard the story several times repeated by the page himself. The weather was very cold and wet, and the companions underwent much hardship on their march. They travelled through a flat and marshy country full of woods and groves of trees, and crossed with dikes and streams. Veneo, however, who had endured so much privation and suffering, began to sink under his fatigues. After travelling for more than 2 days, they arrived at the leaguer. They were told that the besieged were expected every day to surrender at discretion, but they were sent into the trenches with several other volunteers to relieve those already there, many of whom were exhausted with the work and were deserting. As they arrived at the extreme limit of the lines, the besiegers had planted 4 great pieces of battering cannon against the town and fired great shot all the forenoon, without, however, doing much damage. The royalists mustered all their troops upon the line, intending, as it afterwards appeared, to break out at night and force their way through the leaguer. The lines were so close that the soldiers could throw stones at each other as they lay in the trenches, and Veneo and the page could see the king's officers plainly upon the city walls. The royalists did not fire, being short of ammunition, and in the night a mutiny took place among some of the foot soldiers, which prevented the project of cutting their way out from taking effect. The soldiers of both armies were now already mixed on many places upon the line, and no fire was given on either side, as though the royalists were already prisoners. The page left Veneo, who was worn out and ill, and easily made his way into the town, where he found his master. When he returned to the trenches, he found Veneo very ill, and a physician with him, a doctor of the town, named Gibson, as I remember, who told the page that he thought his companion was dying. Veneo, in fact, appeared to be insensible. His eyes were closed, and he was perfectly pale. He lay in a small house just within the lines, which had been deserted by its inhabitants, who were weavers. The gentlemen were under arrest in the town, and it was reported that several were to be immediately shot, of whom it was whispered the Signore Guasconi was to be one. About 2 in the afternoon the general of the besieging army entered the town, and a great rabble of the soldiers with him. The latter broke into many houses to search for plunder, and among them into that in which Veneo was lying. As they came into the room and saw the dying man, they stopped and began to question the page as to who he was. Before he could reply, Veneo opened his eyes with a smile, raised himself suddenly from the straw on which he lay, and stretching out his hand eagerly, as one who welcomes a friend, exclaimed in Italian, "Cavaliere, the consonance is complete." And having said this, he fell back upon the straw again, and the smile still upon his face, he died. The musician stopped a moment, and then glancing at Inglesant with a curious look, said, "It is confidently said that about that very moment the Cavaliere Andrea died at Rome. At any rate, when the page returned to Italy and inquired for him at Rome, he was dead. He caught a fever in one of his visits to the prisons, and died in a few days." "Did the page tell you of the 2 gentlemen who were shot at Colchester?" said Inglesant. "Yes, he told me that Guasconi stood by with his doublet off, expecting his turn, but when the others were shot he was taken back to his prison. They only found out he was an Italian by his asking leave to write to the Grand Duke. I've been told," he continued, "that this poor king was a great lover of music, and played the bass viol himself." "He was a great admirer of church music," said Inglesant. "I've often seen him appoint the service and anthems himself." As the conversation of this man was a great entertainment to Inglesant, so his sudden and unexpected death was a great shock to him. The physician could give no clear explanation of his disease, and the general opinion was that he died of the plague, though it was, of course, the interest of every one in the pest house that this should not be acknowledged. A few days after the burial 2 of the Jesuit fathers arrived from Florence, accompanied by Don Agostino, who, having in vain waited for his friend at Lucca, had sought him at Florence, and finally traced him to his dreary prison. By their influence Inglesant was allowed to depart, and, actuated still by his desire to see Venice, set out, accompanied by Don Agostino, in the hope of reaching that city. They crossed the Apennines and journeyed by Modena, Mantua, Verona, and Padua. These places, which at other times would have excited in Inglesant the liveliest interest, were passed by him now as in a dream. The listless indifference which grew day by day developed at Padua into absolute illness, and Agostino took lodgings for his friend in one of the deserted palaces of which the city was full. A few days' rest from travel and from the excitement produced by novel scenes and by the scorching plains had a soothing and beneficent effect. But Venice being reported to be at that time peculiarly unhealthy, and Inglesant becoming sensible that he was physically unable to prosecute any inquiries there, the friends resolved to abandon their journey in that direction and to return towards Rome. At this juncture Don Agostino received letters which compelled him to return hastily to Siena, and after spending a few days with his friend he left, promising to return shortly and accompany Inglesant to Rome when he was sufficiently recruited by a few weeks' repose. Section 34.